My parents gave my brother a BMW for his 18th birthday, and I was given the cheapest car. My grandparents threw a humiliating party, and all my relatives resented me. I know I sound spoiled, but listen to me. My younger brother, now 20, got a car for his 18th birthday. It wasn't brand new, just a 10-year-old BMW in pretty good shape, but he flaunted it until the end of high school. We both did well academically. Sometimes I even outperformed him. I worked hard, hoping for the same treatment, even volunteering to clean up the neighborhood. A few weeks ago, my 18th birthday came around, and I didn't expect anything extravagant, just something dependable like the car my brother got. But my birthday party was nothing like his. My mom baked him a delicious multi-layered chocolate cake with pudding, while I got a store-bought layer cake. They hired a DJ for him, but for me, it was just my dad's old boombox with some CDs. I kept thinking maybe they had a surprise gift waiting, but nothing came. When the party ended, I asked why there was no car for me when my brother got one. They said they felt he had worked harder for it. I asked what he did that I hadn't because I thought I did just as much, if not more. My grandma overheard the conversation and was really upset. She scolded my parents for playing favorites and announced to everyone that it wasn't fair for them to treat their firstborn so differently. My uncle was the first to speak up, and others who hadn't left yet joined in. Feeling overwhelmed, I went to my room to think. Later, my grandparents convinced me to go out with them, but when I came back, my parents were furious, accusing me of ignoring them to avoid a fight. The next few weeks were tense and silent between us. But then, a few days ago, my parents unexpectedly handed me the keys to a white '98 Subaru. They even paid for the insurance for the next 6 months, just like they did for my brother. I know that having a car is a privilege, not a right, but I can't help feeling like I pressured them into getting me one. I want to clarify a few things. My parents have good incomes and live modestly by choice. They do spend a lot on my brother's college education, covering what his partial scholarship doesn't. I never expected the same treatment and planned to work and pay off my own student loans. Now that I have a car, I'm already looking for a part-time job. This isn't about gender, as we're both male. The Subaru cost them $1,600, similar to what they paid for my brother's car, which was around $13,000. I genuinely liked the Subaru and even mentioned it to my parents, but they didn't seem to care. I tried talking to them about getting a car last year, but they always dodged the conversation. I didn't want to keep bringing it up and sound like a child, so I just kept quiet and hoped. I can't stay with my grandparents because they live in a small one-bedroom apartment. They downsized after their kids grew up to make retirement easier. My grandparents already know everything and told me I did nothing wrong. They had planned to talk to my parents calmly about the car situation, but they took the opportunity to address it when they heard me asking my parents during my brother's 18th birthday in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. Honestly, we shouldn't have had such a big party then, but my parents insisted. As for my brother, we hardly ever talk. Even before he left for college, he was distant. He didn't even show up for my 18th birthday, which I thought was just because he was busy with college, especially since he's out of state. Honestly, I haven't seen or heard from him since Christmas Day, and even then, all I got was a brief, "Congratulations." He did, however, enthusiastically thank our parents for the car they got him. When they handed me the Subaru, my parents barely said a word. I thanked them, but they just waved me off and went inside, almost like they were letting a kid play with a new toy. It was pretty disheartening, and one of the reasons I decided to share this story. I should mention that getting a car was really important to me because without it, I couldn't get a part-time job. We live out in the country, about 10 miles from the nearest bus stop, so I needed to drive to get anywhere. Now that I have the Subaru, I'm planning to look for a part-time job after school as soon as I can. One more thing, I want to make it clear that when I talked to my parents after the party, it wasn't in front of the rest of the family. It was a private conversation, away from everyone else. I made sure to talk to my parents in another room away from everyone else, but my grandmother overheard and then burst in, giving my parents a stern lecture about their behavior. That kicked off the whole mess. Now let me update you on everything that happened before college started. But first, I need to address some comments and messages I received. I genuinely needed a car because there was no other way for me to get a job without one. We lived 10 miles from the nearest bus stop, so personal transportation was a must. To those who suggested I return the car or said I was spoiled, accepting life as unfair, or shouldn't take handouts from crappy parents, please just stop. My inbox was flooded, and it took a while to get through everything. But here's what matters. I did get a part-time job, which later became full-time over the summer after graduation. Unfortunately, about 3 weeks into working part-time, the Subaru blew a cylinder head gasket while I was driving down the highway at 45 miles per hour. The speed sensor went haywire, and I had to pull over and call for help. My grandparents took a look at the car and discovered that someone had dumped a lot of gasket sealant into it, which was still in the coolant. The car had been patched up with temporary fixes before my parents bought it, barely holding together. Even though I drove carefully and never pushed the car hard, it eventually broke down. When I told my parents about the issue, they claimed they had no idea about the problem. Their only reaction was a shrug and a comment that it was karma for buying me the car in the first place. That remark didn't sit well with my grandparents, who witnessed the whole thing and lashed out at my parents like never before. My grandmother told me to go to my room and let them handle the situation. When I was called back into the living room, my parents looked like they'd been through the ringer, lying on the couch, visibly shaken. My uncle and a couple of other relatives were also there. It turns out my grandparents found out from them that when my parents were buying the car, they just went for the cheapest one they could find in the area that was still running. They didn't even bother to inspect the car or properly take down the ad. My uncle, who knows a lot about cars, explained that the engine would need a complete rebuild because the warped block and blown head gasket made it more expensive to fix than the car was worth. I had to call my job and let them know I couldn't come in because the car wasn't working, which essentially put me on an unpaid leave for a while. I want to clarify that my grandparents were the ones who handled everything. They just told me to stay calm and let them and my parents sort it out, which they did. A few days later, they came back with a 1999 Honda Civic hatchback with 180,000 miles on it. It was white, like my Subaru, and drove great. It wasn't all-wheel drive, but it was excellent on the road and had better fuel efficiency. There was also a list of all the recent repairs, like a new radiator, that my uncle had taken care of. I thanked my parents profusely, but they barely acknowledged it, walking away without much of a response. It was like they were completely defeated. We ended up selling the Subaru for $400, which was the best we could get for it with a blown head gasket, and that money went into my savings. But that's only part of the story. You see, I wasn't exaggerating when I said I did better in school than my brother. He got a 30% scholarship out of high school, while I secured a 50% scholarship. Not at the same college, of course, but at a pretty good one that was also closer. My parents were shocked, to say the least. They looked utterly miserable once the shock wore off. I thought it best not to stir things up by asking about it, but my grandmother had other ideas. She decided to confront them head-on, asking if they were happy for me. They claimed they were, but didn't show it in their demeanor. So my grandparents finally asked, "What's the problem? Why don't you love him? He's doing great, even exceeding expectations, and you can't seem to be happy about it. Did you want him to fail? What's the matter?" My mom looked really upset, and my dad couldn't even meet my eyes. They both quietly said that they were happy for me, and even managed to say that they wanted me to succeed in college, just like my brother. They mentioned that they would help cover some of my tuition costs too. My grandparents quickly added that they had better stick to their promise because there shouldn't be any favoritism. I thanked my parents for their help, and my dad gave me a light handshake while my mom hugged me tightly. It felt like they were doing this under the pressure of the situation, and while I was and still am very grateful for the car and the support for my studies, the whole thing just drained me emotionally. I asked my grandparents if they knew why my parents acted this way. I even wondered if I was an unplanned pregnancy. They told me it was time to reveal the truth. I wasn't adopted, as many had speculated. I was, in fact, unplanned. My parents had hoped for a boy and a girl, but ended up with 2 boys. My grandmother explained that my parents had refused to find out my gender before I was born, convinced I would be a girl. They bought a lot of baby items for a girl, but when I arrived, they were disappointed from the start. I ended up using all of my brother's hand-me-downs until I was 3, because they had bought so many girl things that they couldn't use. My grandparents acknowledged that my parents messed up, but they also said it was unlikely they would change after all these years. Since then, my parents haven't talked much about college. They avoided the topic as much as possible. Given some warnings from people who messaged me, I felt paranoid and called the college I was accepted to. I made sure they knew not to take any changes to my enrollment status without verifying it with me directly, in case my parents tried to sabotage my plans. I doubted they would, but I didn't want to take any chances. Unexpectedly, my brother called me out of the blue. He said our grandparents had filled him in on everything, and he apologized in his own way for what had happened. He mentioned that after graduating from college, he planned to stay in the state he currently lived in because he liked it there. Our parents had hoped he'd return, but that didn't seem likely. I told him I understood and might do the same. The rest of the conversation was a bit awkward since we weren't used to talking much. My grandparents and the rest of the family threw me a surprise party over the weekend. It was almost like a redo of my brother's 18th birthday, complete with a DJ and a big chocolate cake that my grandma made. I couldn't thank them enough. My parents were at the party, but they stayed on the sidelines, quietly sipping beer at a far table. They looked even more defeated than before. I think the party wasn't just to celebrate me, but also to subtly remind my parents of what they should have done better. The rest of the family made their disappointment clear, and it seemed like my parents wanted to leave the party early. I couldn't blame them, they were humiliated. My grandmother used to say it's never too late to learn a lesson in humility. As for my personal life, I transitioned from part-time to full-time work after high school, saving up before heading to college. The job paid minimum wage, but work is work, and I wanted to do my best before leaving. I don't plan on making another update after this. After my first post, I was overwhelmed by the negative comments. While 95% of the feedback was positive, the negative ones were mentally draining. Some people seemed to have worse problems than I did and were projecting their issues onto me. Constructive criticism is one thing, but some comments were just outright hostile. It's been 2 years since then, and I didn't expect to post again. My brother and I both went off to college to pursue 4-year degrees. For those who remember my previous posts, I'm the guy whose parents were called out by the family for not treating me as well as my older brother. The tension peaked on my 18th birthday, when my parents made little effort compared to the elaborate celebration they had for my brother's 18th during the pandemic in 2020. They even managed to get a DJ and bought him a car. In contrast, I didn't receive a car or anything close to that kind of party, despite having better academic performance. I worked hard to earn my parents' approval, but I never felt I got it. When I asked why my brother received a car and not me, they claimed he had worked harder, which turned out to be untrue when I earned a larger scholarship. My grandmother overheard and brought the rest of the family into it, and they were planning to intervene anyway. After being confronted by several family members, my parents reluctantly bought me a car to save face. They treated me like a child receiving a new toy, handing me the keys to a late 90s Subaru that I thought was great, until it turned out to have a leaking head gasket held together by sealant. When the car broke down, my parents' response was indifferent. They shrugged and called it karma. This reaction led my grandparents to step in again and organize another family intervention. I received a lot of messages from people questioning if I really needed a car. Some seemed to think I was being pushy or entitled, but honestly, it was a necessity. I couldn't find a job without one since we lived 10 miles from the nearest bus stop, and there was no one available to give me a ride daily. Without a car, making money for college was impossible. Some folks tried to impose their logic on me, often projecting their issues, while others were outright trolls and jerks. I don't even want to remember some of the nasty things they said, especially after I got the "not the asshole" verdict. It was mentally draining, as you can imagine. During the family intervention, my relatives went at my parents over and over again. By the end, my parents looked like scolded children, staring at the ground. The Subaru was sold as junk, and my grandparents basically forced my parents to buy me a better car, a Honda Civic. My uncle thoroughly inspected the car before they bought it. My parents didn't treat me like a child this time, and yes, I still have the Honda. It's still running fine. I've kept up with oil changes and maintenance. No accidents, as I'm a careful driver. The final straw for my parents was when I got a better scholarship than my brother. All their previous excuses for favoring him were invalidated, and they were forced to offer me support that felt insincere. I often wondered why they didn't seem to like me as much. Later, I learned from my grandmother that my parents had wanted their second child to be a girl. They were so convinced I would be a girl that they bought a bunch of girls' stuff without even checking the ultrasound results. My grandmother eventually admitted that my mom tried to raise me as a girl for the first 6 months of my life. She dressed me in girls' clothes and called me by a different name, with my dad allowing it all. I know it's true because my grandmother showed me old family photos of me with my brother when I was a baby, dressed in pink. Some of the photos even had tags with the name my parents had chosen for a girl. But once they realized I wasn't a girl, they stopped dressing me that way. After my grandparents put a stop to my mom dressing me as a girl, they confronted her, telling her that trying to raise me as something I wasn't was wrong, especially without giving me a choice. Despite being old school, my grandparents are surprisingly open-minded. They pressured my parents to stop treating me like the girl they had hoped for. Instead of buying me new clothes, my parents gave me my brother's hand-me-downs for years. My grandparents eventually noticed and intervened, preventing my childhood from being much worse than it was. They never told me about all this until the last few years, and I am incredibly grateful to them for protecting me. My mother struggled to call me by my real name for about 2 years. Since my parents didn't get the girl they wanted, they refused to connect with me, unlike with my brother, the son they truly desired. When my grandparents found out that I wasn't receiving new things like my brother, they threatened to petition for custody and had evidence of the neglect. My parents, terrified of a public scandal, pretended to love me for a while, but as I grew older, their pretense turned into indifference and possibly even disdain. I'm not sure if it was hate, as hate still implies some level of care, but indifference is the absence of love. My parents couldn't accept that their unwanted son outperformed their favorite. Since I moved away, they haven't talked to me much and barely spoke to the rest of the family. They've thrown themselves into their work, partly because the family pressured them to contribute to my college expenses, as well as my brother's, and partly because work gave them an excuse to isolate themselves. My grandmother suspects they've even slept in their car a few times to avoid coming home. I've only seen my parents at Christmas gatherings at my uncle's house in recent years. They barely speak to me, as if they've stopped trying to act like I'm their son. It seems they don't want me in their lives anymore, feeling humiliated by the family's intervention and unable to accept that they brought it on themselves. Now, they've become workaholics who don't engage much with anyone. My grandmother told me that my bedroom has remained untouched since I left, while my parents kept my brother's room spotless and ready for him to return after college. But that never happened. They flew out for his graduation and had a big celebration, which I wasn't invited to, not that I could have afforded to go. My grandparents, however, did go and filled me in on the details. My parents were still holding on to the hope that my brother would come home, but he awkwardly told them that he had already secured a job from an internship he did last year and had found his own apartment. My dad was furious, and my mom was in tears begging him to come back, but he refused. Over the past 2 years, my brother and I have reconnected a bit. He found my Reddit account and reached out. He wasn't angry, he just wanted to talk. He admitted that our parents put a lot of pressure on him. Our mom smothered him, especially when I wasn't around, and our dad was very strict with his expectations. The fact that I did better than my brother, despite them putting all their efforts into him, shattered them. Now they're even more broken because my brother refused to go back home. The way our parents treated him is also why we stopped communicating as siblings for so long. Growing up, he used to bully me, but that was because he was the favorite, though it came with strings attached. After he moved out and got counseling, he realized the toll it took on him. He also has a girlfriend he met in college, whom he kept a secret because he knew our parents wouldn't approve. When they found out, my brother exploded. My mom criticized his girlfriend without even meeting her, and my brother defended her. His girlfriend is in nursing school and will graduate in a year. He says she's the best, and from how he described her, she seems great. I've never met her, but she sounds wonderful. My grandmother told me that my mom even went as far as hiring a private investigator to find out more about my brother's girlfriend. She was annoyed to learn that the girlfriend was clean as a whistle, from a good family, and had no issues, much to my mom's disappointment. My grandmother mentioned that the private investigator incident was a big reason my brother decided not to return home, even though he had already made up his mind before meeting his girlfriend. My dad remained almost stoically silent about the whole situation, but my mom accidentally revealed to my brother that she had hired a detective. This led to a heated argument, with my parents accusing my brother of being ungrateful despite all they had given him. My brother responded by saying that being the favorite child felt like abuse because they nearly forced him to become like them. When my parents shared this with our grandparents, it led to another family intervention, and I was involved via video call. My parents tried to ignore me, but even my brother insisted they acknowledge me. We all told them that enough was enough. They have 2 sons and needed to start treating us fairly. We reminded them that letting something as trivial as us not being born the gender they wanted ruin their love for me was absurd from the very beginning. During the intervention, my father finally broke down, shouting, "You want us to admit we messed up? Well, we did. What do you want from us? Do you want us to travel back in time and fix everything? We paid for part of the tuition at King's College, too. What more does he want from us?" It ended poorly, with my mom crying and briefly apologizing to me before quickly shifting her attention to my brother, who was on the video call. She cried and apologized to him until he told her to come back and actually apologize to me like she meant it. At that point, my dad grabbed the phone, turned it off, and told everyone to leave. The last thing my grandparents said to my parents was that they were very disappointed and hoped that losing both sons would make them realize the mistake of favoring one over the other. Now my parents are estranged from the rest of the family. My grandmother has heard rumors that they're planning to move, despite having a paid-off country house and great careers. It seems foolish to me, but since my brother and I likely won't be going back, it might not be an issue. I doubt they'd be happy to have me visit after everything that happened. I'm still grateful to them for helping me with college expenses, which significantly reduced my student loans. However, as parents, I think we can all agree that they didn't do a very good job.